Well, if you can believe it, this is the 78th and final module of the AP Microeconomics course, and you are probably as happy to get here as I am. With the completion of this module, you will have covered all of the information that you need to know that could appear on the AP Microeconomics exam. So in this final module, in the unit on market failure and the role of government, we look at the topic of income inequality and income distribution in the United States. In other words, in a market economy, how is the income that is received by different groups of people divided up amongst the population, and what problems are caused as a result of that? One of the things that we know is that in the last few decades, there has been increasing income inequality between different groups in this country, and it has become such a big issue that it is now a major issue in our politics and in our presidential campaigns. And the American people are paying a lot of attention to this issue. So it's an important one, and one that we're going to explore in this last module. So in this module, I will define poverty and describe its causes and consequences, explain how income inequality in America has changed over time, and discuss how Social Security and similar government programs affect poverty and income inequality in this country. So first, let's talk about the problem of poverty itself. What is it, and why is it a problem? Okay. The definition of poverty is arbitrary, though the government has tried to improve the statistical measures since the first definition of poverty was created in the 1960s. If a person or household falls below a specific poverty line as defined by the government, they are considered part of the population living in poverty. So, for example, back in 2009, if you were a single adult living alone, if you made $10,956 a year or less, you were considered officially poor by the government. The more people you have in your household to support, the more income you have to have. So the cutoff level to be in the poverty group is higher the more people you have. So for example, for a household of 2 adults and 2 children, 4 people in that household, the poverty line is higher. If you made $21,756 or less in 2009, you are considered officially poor. And so this is considered the poverty threshold by the government, which means it's the minimum annual income that is considered adequate to purchase the necessities of life. But as living standards have risen in the United States, some people think that this number is actually too low, that actually you need to make more than the government's official poverty level to really live a decent life in the United States. So there are many good resources about poverty out there if you're interested in taking a look at this a little bit more. But the University of Wisconsin at Madison has an institute for research on poverty with a good website. Here you can learn about how the U.S. government defines poverty, how the poverty line was first developed, and how economists have attempted to improve the measure. There are also links to data and current research. So if you're interested in exploring the topic of poverty more, this is a great place to turn to get that information. So let's look at some trends in poverty. What has happened to poverty in the United States recently? Well, first of all, the percentage of Americans living in poverty rises and falls with the business cycle. Okay? And although the official poverty level threshold is adjusted each year to reflect changes in the cost of living, it has not been adjusted upward over time to reflect the long-term rise in the standard of living of the average American, as I mentioned in the previous slide. And the poverty rate, of course, is the percentage of the population that is living below the poverty threshold. So if we look at this graph, you can see the trend in the poverty rate in the United States since the 1970s. Now, during times of recession, the poverty rate rises. That makes sense. People lose their jobs and more people fall into poverty as a result of that and become poor. And during recoveries, the poverty rate usually falls. As people get their jobs back, they start making money and they are no longer poor. But it might be surprising to you to note that there is no long-term decline in U.S. poverty rates. And it's interesting to note that the poverty rate is higher, or was higher in 2009 than it was in 1973. If you go back to 1959, you can see that we've had a big decline in the poverty rate in the 1960s and into the 1970s. That's when it fell significantly. But since that time, you can see it has gone up and down with no long-term trend downward. we've remained relatively stable in terms of the poverty rate. So even though living standards have increased, even though the United States has become a much wealthier nation in that time, we haven't really made a significant dent in the poverty rate in the United States. And you would think that if we were becoming a wealthier nation over time, that fewer and fewer people would be poor, as there would be more income to divide amongst the population. But that hasn't happened clearly by the data in this graph. So the question we have to ask is, why? Why haven't we been able to make progress in reducing the number of poor people in our country? Well, first we have to say, well, who are the poor? What kinds of people, what groups of people tend to be more likely to be poor? In 2012, there were about 46.5 million Americans out of about 320 million of us who were actually living in poverty. That translates to a poverty rate of 15% of the population, or about 1 out of every 7 people who is defined as officially poor. But poverty is not spread evenly across the nation. If it was, in 2009 we would expect the same poverty rate for whites, African Americans, Hispanics, men, and women. For example, in 2009, 14.3% of Americans lived in poverty. In 2012, it was 15%. But that rate was 25.9% for African Americans and 25.3% for Hispanics. These two groups are overrepresented in the poverty ranks because they make up a smaller percentage of the population. If you are a single mother, unmarried, you are also much more likely to be in poverty than the average American. Single mothers, as heads of households, have a poverty rate of 32.5%. The statistics also pretty clearly indicate that if a person does not have full-time work, they are more likely to be living in poverty. Only 3.6% of full-time workers who have a full-time job were poor in 2008. However, adults who worked part-time or not at all, 87.3% of them were likely to be poor. Because part-time workers usually receive lower wages and fewer benefits, they find themselves members of what we call the working poor, people who are working and have jobs, but they're officially poor. Economists have found some evidence that this group of Americans is actually growing. And here you see those statistics that I've just mentioned and the poverty rates for these different groups of people. What really stands out here is that if you're non-Hispanic and white, you only have a poverty rate of 9.7%. It's much higher, you can see, for Hispanics and African Americans. So there are differences based on race and ethnicity in terms of who is most likely to be poor. You can see here that I mentioned that female-headed households, with no husband present, much more likely to be poor. And compare that with married couples, who are much less likely to be poor. A married couple only has a poverty rate of 6.3%. However, it is interesting to note that about 39% of all poor families were married couples. So it still does occur amongst married couples. I also mentioned that adults who work full-time, very unlikely to be poor, only 2.9% of them in 2012. And notice the high poverty rate, 85.4%, of those who worked only part-time or not at all, the group most likely to be poor. So that gives us an idea of the groups of people who are more likely to be poor, less likely to be poor. But now we need to ask the question, well, what causes poverty? Why are some people poor? Anything that creates a barrier to a full-time job, earning a decent wage, is a cause of poverty. So some examples of this would be educational attainment, or educational opportunity, or quality of one's education. What we found is that there is an 83% college premium as of 2013, meaning that if you receive a college degree, you on average make 83% more money over the course of your lifetime than someone that only has a high school diploma. So access to education and access to quality education is very important for escaping poverty. And those groups of people that receive poor educations, that are raised in poverty and don't have the opportunity to get a good education are much more likely to be poor. Language barriers, meaning lack of proficiency in English, are another cause of poverty. We know that there are a lot of immigrants to this country who have come from Latin American countries or Mexico and places like that who haven't learned English yet or are just in the process of learning English, and they can't access the same educational opportunities, and they are more likely to be poor. We know that there is racial discrimination and gender discrimination, and as much as we've tried to reduce it, it still exists. And that can keep groups of people in those groups in lower paying jobs or prevent them from getting good jobs, and that can cause poverty. And sometimes it's just bad luck. Sometimes people get sick. Maybe they get some kind of long-term illness like cancer or something, and they're out of work, or they lose their job through no fault of their own, or there's some kind of huge medical expense that they have. And so sometimes people just suffer bad luck, and that pushes them into poverty. So there are all different causes of poverty that are out there. Now, for the AP exam, you should know the causes of poverty because you could be asked some questions about it, particularly in the multiple choice section of the AP exam. So make sure you study these. So what are the consequences of poverty then? Okay, if someone is poor, what does that lead to? Well, first of all, about 17% of children in the United States are living in poverty, and that's really a tragic statistic. And because poverty is associated with certain things, poor health, less frequent health care, children in poverty can suffer long-term health effects and learning disabilities. Because if you're poor, you're less likely to go to a doctor or to be able to afford to go to a doctor or a hospital when you're sick. And so you don't get treatment for your illness and your sickness. And that can lead to long-term health problems that can hurt your opportunity to become educated, and sometimes it can lead to learning disabilities that prevent you from achieving your potential. There is lack of access to affordable housing. Many times children in these situations are moving from house to house, living with friends and relatives and people like that, and they can't stay in a stable school situation. Their parents don't stay in a stable work situation because they can't afford housing of their own. And so that can be a significant problem as well, lack of access to affordable housing. And so children with poor health and learning disabilities usually find completion of college to be much more difficult than those without, and thus avenues for college degrees and high wages become closed to them. And they suffer from lifelong learning disabilities, and they can't escape poverty. And this is what we call the cycle of poverty. They are born into poverty, and the consequences of poverty prevent them from being able to escape poverty. And while there are examples of people that have done that, the overall trend is that many, many of them do not escape poverty. You can see here in this table the percent of 8th graders from 1988 who finished college. If their parents were in the bottom fifth of income earners, you can see that their math test score, 3% of them were in the bottom quartile. 30% of 8th graders who finished college had parents in the top quartile. If you finished in the top quartile for the mathematics test score, 29% of them had parents that were in the bottom quartile of income earners, while 74% had parents in the top quartile. So being born into a family that has access to education and income and those kinds of opportunities allows those students to be much more successful academically and gives them much more opportunities for going to college, graduating from college, and having college success and a good job later in life. So because of this, we say poverty is self-perpetuating. It creates what we call a cycle of poverty. The children of the poor start at such a disadvantage in terms of their health, in terms of learning disabilities, in terms of their nutrition, in terms of their access to education and good schools and things like that. They start out with such a disadvantage relative to other Americans in the middle or upper classes that it's very hard for them to escape it and to achieve a better life. And so they end up staying in poverty with a poor job, lower levels of education, and poverty continues for them. And that has become a real problem in our country, the self-perpetuating nature of poverty. Now, one problem facing any society is how to break this cycle of poverty. So are there any things that we can do to break it? Have we tried anything that we've found to be successful? Well, yes, we actually have. Back in 2006, there was a study that found that high-quality early childhood programs like Head Start, focused on education and healthcare, lead to significant advantage for kids. In other words, if instead of, allowing these children to experience the consequences of poverty throughout their learning lives and to experience lack of success and failure in school, and then they end up in a poor job, which could lead them into criminal activity, and then on the other end, we have to arrest them and put them in prison, and then we pay for that as a society. If we put our money, instead of prison on the other end, if we put our money into providing these poor kids with early childhood education, preschool education, provide them with good health care and nutrition early in life, then we erase a lot of the disadvantages that they have, and they are much more likely to then be successful with their peers when they go into the public education system and be successful in graduating from high school, going on to college, and getting a good job. So investing our money as a society in these kinds of programs can help break the cycle of poverty. And it provides advantages for them, not only for their lives, but for society, because they become productive members of society, and we're not paying for them in terms of social welfare programs and prison on the other end. So this could be an avenue to pursue. But with anything, it has trade-offs and costs and benefits, and as a society, this becomes a debatable political issue that we have to decide what we want to do about it. But we know that children in these kinds of programs were less likely to engage in destructive behaviors. They were more likely to end up with a job and to earn a higher salary later on. Another study in 2003 found that for every dollar that we spend as a society on early childhood intervention programs, as a society, we get a marginal social benefit of $4 to $7 back in benefits. So for every dollar we pay in cost, if we get $4 to $7 back in benefit, then the marginal social benefit of these programs is much higher than the marginal social cost of these programs. So while America is a rich country, income is not distributed equally across the population. This explains why a rich country like the United States can still have many people living in poverty. Now, suppose we divided the populations into fifths, or quintiles. If we had an equal distribution of income, it would look like the third column in this table. Well, not the third column, I'm sorry, this is a different table. Let me see if I have the right table here. I don't think I put the right table in here, but let me just kind of explain what I mean by this. If we had an equal distribution of income, then each quintile of the population would have 20% of total income. So in the graph that I have here, if you look at the fourth column, where it says percent of total income, that would be a series of 20% all the way down. Each quintile would have 20% of total income if it was distributed equally among groups. But you can clearly see that we don't have a column of 20s there. This table tells us that the bottom 20% of the population earns far less than 20% of the total income in the United States. In fact, as of 2012, they only earn 3.2% of total income. And the top 20% of the population earns far more than the 20% of total income. The top 20% earns fully 51% of total income. And if we take it even farther, the top 5% of Americans earn 22.3% of total income. So the United States is a clear example of unequal distribution of income among groups. Now, this does not mean that the distribution is bad or that it's unjust. It doesn't mean that it's good or fair or anything like that. It is simply a presentation of the facts and compared to the hypothetical equal distribution. An important statistic is actually at the bottom of this graph, where you see the median income and the mean income. While the mean income looks relatively high, it can be skewed unnaturally upward by a few high income earners that drag up the total and make the average much higher. The median income is probably a better number to look at because this means that half of the people are making more than this amount of money in the United States, and half of the households are making less than that. And you can see as of 2012, the median income in the United States was $51,017 for a household in this country. So mean household income, remember, is the average income across all households. And as I said, that $71,000 figure can be unnaturally skewed up by a few very high income earners that are earning millions of dollars, and drags the average up. The median household income doesn't do that. It's the income of the household lying at the exact middle of the income distribution, and so is probably a more accurate measure of how income is distributed. And as I said, it's quite unequally distributed in the United States. The average income of the poorest fifth of families is less than a quarter of the average income of families in the middle. We've seen that. The richest fifth have an average income more than 3 times that of families in the middle. And the incomes of the richest fifth of the population are on average about 15 times as high as those of the poorest fifth. Now, income was much more equally distributed in the 1940s after World War II, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, but since 1980, we have seen rising inequality continuously in the United States. And the distribution of income in America has become much more unequal since 1980, to the point where in 2016 it has now become a major political issue in the current presidential campaign. Now, a country's level of income inequality can be measured with a statistic that is known as the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a number that summarizes a country's level of income inequality based on how unequally income is distributed across quintiles. So, if a country has a Gini coefficient of 0, the income is distributed completely equally. If the Gini coefficient is 1, all of the income goes to one person. This is as unequal as it gets. So it's a number between 0, complete equality, up to a number of 1, complete inequality. And so if we look at something called the Lorenz Curve, it shows the line of equality. And so when you see that line of equality in this graph, if income was completely distributed, then the Lorenz curve would look like that, a constant line there, with 20% of income going to each group. 20% of the population would get 20% of the income, 40% would get 40% of the income, 60% would get 60% of the income, and so on. But what this Lorenz curve shows, that's bowed out, shows that the first 20% of Americans get a very small percentage of the total income, but the top 20% earn a very high percentage of the total income. And so that's another, the further bowed out this curve is, the more income inequality there is in a country. Now this is a map that shows the Gini coefficient applied to countries around the world. You can see that, in Ukraine and other countries that, and many European countries, particularly Scandinavian countries, they have much less income inequality. You can see that, with the exception of a few countries in the southern portion of Africa that have high levels of income inequality, the countries with the highest levels of income inequality tend to be in Latin America and South America. And if you look at the Gini coefficient for the United States, it's 0.468, which is relatively high when compared to other wealthy nations in Europe, Australia, or Canada. There is greater income inequality, as we've seen in South America and parts of Africa and Asia, but income inequality in the United States is something certainly to be concerned about as we look at this map of the Gini coefficient. Now, the course description for this course recommends that you know the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient. Now, you will not have to calculate the Gini coefficient on the exam, but you may need to interpret Gini coefficient values for the AP exam and what they mean, or to be able to interpret the Lorenz curve and what it means, particularly on a multiple choice question. So make sure that you familiarize yourself with these two measures, the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient. Now, if we look at long-term trends in income inequality in the United States, you can see two different periods of time here. In the period since the end of World War II up to 1980, you can see that in panel A, income gains amongst the different fifths of the population were relatively equal, meaning that incomes in all five groups were growing relatively equally, around the 2% range or a little higher than that. But since 1980, you can see that the incomes of those in the bottom fifth have grown hardly at all. Those in the second fifth have grown just a teeny bit. The third fifth, they've grown about 3 times as much as those in the, well, not 3 times as much, but twice as much as those in the second fifth. The fourth fifth, their incomes have grown 0.78%, and the richest fifth, their incomes have grown 1.78%. So you can see the incomes of the wealthiest people in America are growing much more quickly than the incomes of the poorest Americans. And that's a trend that has been around since 1980. You can also see in panel B that, from the period from World War II up until that time period, that the share of total income going to the top 10% remained relatively stable during that time period. But since 1980, the share of total income going to the top 10% of income earners in the United States has been growing and growing and growing to the point now where it's reached levels that go back to the income that was received during the Gilded Age in the United States, or the Roaring '20s, when income was widely unequal in this country. And we're approaching that again, which is why it is becoming such a big issue in our politics now. Now, the problem with this is that income inequality creates economic insecurity. Suppose one adult in the household lost a job or someone got very sick and there was no health insurance. These events could put a family that was once safely above the poverty level line into poverty. Because these uncertain events can cause any family to have economic insecurity, we have a welfare state to provide temporary assistance. In other words, the U.S. government helps to protect the welfare or well-being of different groups of people to prevent them from suffering more poverty. So the United States has developed these anti-poverty programs that are both means-tested and non-means-tested. A program is means-tested if it is available only to those with limited means, meaning the poor. A non-means tested program is available to anyone regardless of income. The U.S. also separates programs on the basis of whether the program provides monetary benefits to recipients or in-kind benefits. An in-kind benefit is a good or service that is received rather than receiving cash. This table here summarizes the major anti-poverty programs in the United States. And it is clear that Medicare and Medicaid, both government health care programs, are the largest expenditures on welfare state programs in this country. So let's look at these kinds of programs. Okay, a means-tested program is simple. The government establishes criteria like a level of income, and if you earn less than this amount, you qualify for benefits. These are the classic welfare programs that most developed nations use to alleviate poverty. In the United States, the high-profile welfare programs are temporary assistance for needy families, or TANF, food stamps, which is the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and Medicaid, which is health insurance for people with lower incomes. There is also something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, which works like a negative tax. If a low-income worker is earning money at a job, rather than paying taxes to the government, he or she receives a subsidy, which adds to the wages from the job. Then there are Social Security programs and unemployment insurance. High-profile programs that are non-means tested include Social Security and unemployment insurance. Social Security was designed to guarantee retirement income for senior citizens. but also includes payments for disabled workers and survivors of working adults who die. Social Security is funded by a small tax on your wages, and benefits depend on how much taxable income a person earned in his or her lifetime. The more you've earned, the more you get in Social Security income when you retire, although there is a sliding scale, so it disproportionately provides a little more income to those that made less. Unemployment insurance is funded by a small tax on employers, and if a worker loses his or her job, he or she may receive monthly payments up to about 35% of his or her previous salary. These payments can be received for up to 26 weeks unless Congress increases the benefits during particularly nasty recessions, and they did do that, extend them significantly during the Great Recession that we went through recently. So what effect have these programs had on poverty and inequality in the United States? Have they reduced poverty? Have they reduced inequality? The idea behind progressive income taxes and a welfare system is twofold. Number one, those with the highest incomes pay larger shares of income taxes. And number two, the poor receive transfer payments as welfare benefits. This is typical income redistribution. The rich pay more in taxes and the poor receive transfer payments. Ideally, this should help to make the income distribution more equal than it would be in the absence of such a system. Have they been successful? Well, this table here shows estimates that indicate that the poverty rate for all groups would have been much higher in the absence of the progressive taxes and transfers in the U.S. Notice it particularly helped the elderly, who would have had a poverty rate of 48% without these programs and one of only 9.8% with these programs. This table here shows that the income distribution would have been more unequal if our taxes and transfer programs did not exist. The poorest fifth of Americans would have only received 0.7% of national income without these programs, but with it get 3.7%. And you can see that the income of the top fifth of Americans is reduced by these programs. They would have received 54.3% of total national income without them, but only get 46.4% with it. So it has had an effect of transferring income from the wealthiest to the poorest. But, as always, there is significant and serious political debate in this country over income redistribution. What it leads to, whether it's right, whether it's wrong, whether we should do more, whether we should do less, whether this is the government's responsibility or not. And this is a debate that economists cannot settle. Economists can provide us with the facts of what is happening, but whether these programs are right or wrong, or whether we should do more or less, are based on your values, what your philosophy is, what you consider to be right and wrong. But they concern these questions. Most people agree that senior citizens, the disabled, and the poor should have some sort of economic safety net. The big debates are centered on how big the welfare system should be and who should receive benefits and for how long. And so there are two main arguments against income redistribution. One argument, people say, is some have the philosophical belief that this is simply not the role of the government. The role of the government is to establish the rule of law and to enforce contracts and to provide public goods, but not to redistribute income. The second argument against it is that higher tax rates to fund more welfare programs may cost the nation in terms of efficiency. In other words, more equity comes at a cost of less efficiency. So we have arguments about how large the welfare state should be, the trade-off between efficiency and equity, the high marginal tax rates to finance an extensive welfare state. Does that reduce the incentive to work? Do people work less if they're taxed more because of it? And that means testing programs to reduce the cost of the welfare state also might reduce the incentive to work, because if someone gets a job, then they lose some of their means-tested benefits, and maybe they would be better off getting those benefits than having a job. So these are all debates that are out there over income redistribution. Now, how could we address the second argument? Well, we could make the welfare programs more cost-effective and eliminate waste and fraud and provide the benefits only to those who truly need them. A strict means test for welfare benefits can create a unique problem known as the notch. For example, suppose a single mother earns $5,000 of welfare benefits if her income is below $15,000 and zero benefits if she earns more than $15,000. Suppose she earned $14,900 from her wages and $5,000 from her benefits. Her total income would be $19,900. If she can work a few more hours and earn another $1,000 from her wages, she will lose the $5,000 in benefits. So her total income would be only $15,900. This serves as a disincentive to working harder, and so the economy loses some efficiency. However, this notch can be avoided if the benefits are gradually phased out as more income is earned from work. And you can see here in this table how we compare to other countries in terms of the percent of our GDP that we put into social welfare programs. It's much higher in France than it is here in the United States, but you can also see that the French pay much higher marginal tax rates than we do here in the United States to support those programs. So much of the debate over income redistribution leads to differences in political opinion. If you believe that the disincentive effects of generous benefits and high taxes, then you are likely to look less favorably on welfare state programs than if you believe they are fairly small. Some of the political controversy over the welfare state involves differences in opinion about the trade-offs we have just discussed. Economic analysis, however, by improving our knowledge of the facts, can help resolve some of these differences. To an important extent, however, differences of opinion on income redistribution reflect differences in our values and differences in our philosophies. And those are differences that economics cannot resolve. Here is a link to the Department of Health and Human Services poverty website. Here's an activity that we can do on poverty. And here is a video on the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient.
If that were the case, half of the population, 50% of the population, would be in possession of 50% of the income. And we would see that this point would be on that line of total equality. And this would continue all the way through, so that 75% of the income was owned by 70% of the population. The end result would be a line of perfect equality which looks like this. And again, sometimes it's called the egalitarian line. And in an economy that did have a perfectly even distribution of income, this would be the Lorenz curve for that economy. In reality, however, this does not exist. In all economies, income isn't distributed evenly, and as a result we end up with a small percentage of the population having a larger percentage of the income. In a situation of total equality, the poorest 50% of the population would still have 50% of the income of the economy. In reality, however, it would be less than this. So, for example, if the poorest 50% of the population earned 25%.
And here is an activity that we will be doing on the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient. Here's a video on economic freedom and income equality that you can see. Here's an activity that we can do on that. And then here is a summary of what we've learned in this module. And this concludes our look at Module 78, Income Inequality and Income Distribution, and it also concludes our work in AP Microeconomics.